In the frozen stillness of the Ardennes winter, long before the sun pushed its way through the fog, a single tank lay silent. Its steel frame, feared across continents, now breathed only the faint echo of a dying engine. For the men standing beside it, the silence said more than any report ever could. Something deeper than machinery had failed. Something fundamental. Most stories of war begin with the clash of armies. This one begins with a question whispered in the dark. How does a force built on iron, discipline, and ambition come to a halt not by enemy fire, but by the emptiness of a fuel gauge? The answer was not lying on a battlefield. It was stacked quietly in an abandoned American depot, where rows of untouched gasoline cans gleamed in the dawn like a revelation. That morning, as German troops crowded around 50,000 gallons of American fuel, a realization colder than the December wind settled over their commander. Victory would not be decided by courage or tactics. It would be decided by what fed the engines of war. And the Americans had oceans. Germany had drops. Modern wars rarely collapse in a single moment. They unravel quietly through shortages, delays, and decisions made months before the first shot is fired. By the summer of 1944, the German war machine was already bleeding from within. Allied bombers had reduced synthetic fuel plants to twisted metal, cutting production by more than 90%. What flowed from the Reich's refineries no longer matched the demands of a mechanized army stretched across continents. Commanders rationed gasoline by the liter. Aircraft sat grounded. Veteran tank crews trained on maps instead of engines. Yet Adolf Hitler envisioned one last reversal of fate, a massive winter offensive through the Ardennes. Its purpose was brutally simple: break the American front, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied coalition. But hidden beneath the boldness was a truth that only his logisticians dared whisper. The assault had no hope unless German forces captured American fuel along the way. For Joachim Peiper and his Kampfgruppe, this reality defined every choice before the battle even began. Peiper's armored spearhead, designated the Schwerpunkt of the offensive, received just 31,000 gallons of fuel, barely enough for 50 miles of combat operations. The Meuse River, their essential objective, lay 65 miles away. The mathematics were merciless. Success depended not on maneuver, but on seizing depots the Americans might abandon. When Peiper attended the final briefing on December 14th, his orders reflected this desperation. Tanks would move in single file to conserve fuel. Engines were to be shut down during every halt longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American supplies was not merely encouraged, it superseded all tactical priorities. Victory required gasoline before territory. Even ammunition was secondary. At dawn on December 16th, the German offensive erupted with an artillery barrage powerful enough to recall the early triumphs of the Blitzkrieg. But the veneer of strength masked the fragility beneath. Panzer columns quickly bogged down on narrow country roads that German maps had misrepresented as highways. Vehicles designed for the open Russian steppes groaned through muddy forest paths. Congestion grew for miles. Engines idled longer than intended, and precious gallons evaporated into the cold air. Then came Lanzareth. 18 American reconnaissance soldiers, barely more than a squad, held off Peiper's advancing column for nearly 10 hours. Their resistance forced dozens of German tanks and half-tracks to idle in place, consuming the very resource the offensive could not spare. By the time the bottleneck cleared, Kampfgruppe Peiper had already burned almost half of its allocated fuel. When the column finally reached the outskirts of Hansfeld in the pre-dawn hours of December 17th, the realization struck with brutal clarity. After barely 20 miles of progress, Peiper's tanks were already running dry. The campaign meant to rescue the Reich had become a race against its own empty fuel lines. That was the moment they discovered the American depot. The captured fuel at Hansfeld did more than bring Peiper's column back to life. For a brief moment, it revived the illusion that the offensive could still succeed. His crews worked feverishly in the bitter wind, pouring American gasoline into German tanks as if each gallon were a lifeline. Engines rumbled back to life. Tracks bit into the frozen earth. Every man felt the fragile momentum returning. But as Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium, the nature of the war began to reveal itself. The first signs came in the form of documents. Among the abandoned American offices at Hansfeld, a German sergeant found shipping manifest ordinary papers that told an extraordinary story. The fuel Peiper had just captured had crossed an entire world, from Texas to New York, from New York to Liverpool, from Liverpool across the Channel, and then hundreds of miles by truck to the front. 6,000 miles in 6 weeks. What Germany guarded with divisions, the United States delivered with routine efficiency. The deeper the column advanced, the sharper the contrast became. At Bielingen, they seized more fuel, maps, rations, and ammunition. Yet the maps showed something unsettling. American depots were everywhere. At crossroads, behind ridgelines, near villages and rail stations. The 1st U.S. Army alone held millions of gallons in reserve. For the Germans, fuel was treasure. For the Americans, it was simply inventory. Still, the offensive pressed on. Tigers and Panthers rolled forward, consuming fuel at brutal rates: 2.5 gallons per mile for the Tigers, 1.5 for the Panthers. The rugged Ardennes terrain increased those numbers by nearly 40%. Each mile was bought with gasoline the Germans did not have. Then came the moment that shattered even the hardiest illusions. As Piper's vanguard approached the vast American depot at Stavelot, over 2 million gallons, stacked across 15 acres, they expected another miraculous windfall. Instead, they found American engineers already at work. Under orders to deny the fuel at all costs, the men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion laid trails of gasoline between the stacks of jerry cans. White phosphorus grenades were distributed. One spark changed everything. A wall of fire shot into the sky, a roaring column of flame and smoke that could be seen for miles. The inferno consumed the fuel in hours, but its meaning burned far longer. The Americans could afford to destroy more gasoline in an afternoon than the Germans had received for the entire offensive. As the flames reached 1,000 feet, Piper's men understood what the numbers had been trying to tell them for months. The enemy possessed abundance beyond comprehension, and the contrast only grew sharper. The Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks, running night and day, delivered more fuel in a single week than Piper's entire army group would see in a month. Pipelines laid under the English Channel pumped 1 million gallons a day into France. Standardized American vehicles burned fuel efficiently, carried interchangeable parts, and were replaced faster than Germany could repair its own. The summit of the offensive had been reached, but it was not marked by triumph. It was marked by the realization that the German advance was climbing a mountain made of numbers they could never overcome. By December 19th, the illusion of momentum had collapsed. Kampfgruppe Piper was still fighting, still maneuvering, still pushing toward the Meuse, but the fuel gauges told a harsher truth. Each engagement burned more than the column could capture. Each mile forward was borrowed time. Reports from maintenance units grew more desperate. Panthers abandoning the march because their tanks ran dry. Tigers left behind on roadsides like gutted monuments to a fading ambition. At Stammont, the weight of the crisis became undeniable. German crews fought fiercely, but every maneuver cost gallons they could never replace. Piper consolidated what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons in total, barely enough for one final attack or a retreat, but not both. He chose to press on, knowing that strategy had long since given way to survival. Meanwhile, the Americans were preparing for January operations with a scale of planning unimaginable to their opponents. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the coming month. The request was approved without debate. On the same day, U.S. C-47 transports flew hundreds of sorties into the besieged town of Bastogne, delivering more fuel to a single surrounded garrison than Piper's entire formation possessed at its peak. Clear skies on December 23rd sealed the German fate. Allied aircraft took to the air P-47 seconds, B-26 seconds, and fighter bombers, each burning fuel by the hundreds of gallons every hour. One day of air operations consumed more gasoline than Germany had allocated for its entire winter offensive. Bombs fell on roads, bridges, and supply lines, turning the German advance into a patchwork of isolated pockets. That night, Piper faced a decision that no commander wants to make. With the encirclement tightening around La Glaise, the last drops of fuel were pooled into a handful of vehicles. The remaining tanks, half-tracks, and trucks machines, worth fortunes in steel and manpower, were drained dry. Crews smashed radios, set demolition charges, and prepared to abandon the armored beasts they had spent years mastering. The next hours unfolded in a quiet more haunting than battle. Men who had once charged across continents now slipped through forests on foot, carrying only what they could. Behind them, 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 vehicles sat waiting for destruction. When the explosions came, they lit the night with brief bursts of orange, final markers of a force that had moved 60 miles, captured depots, shattered towns, and yet had been defeated not by an enemy maneuver, but by the simplest arithmetic of war. Of the 5,000 men who began the operation with Kampfgruppe Piper, roughly 770 would return. The Ardennes had taken its toll in lives and steel, but its most devastating blow was conceptual. The battle revealed, with unflinching clarity, the boundary between courage and capability. German troops had fought with determination. Their tanks had proven formidable, their commanders had been experienced. But none of that mattered once the fuel was gone. For the first time, it became undeniable. Modern war was no longer a contest of will, it was a contest of supply. From the American perspective, the Battle of the Bulge was not merely a test of courage, it was a test of a logistical system built across oceans, continents, and industrial landscapes. While German commanders rationed fuel by the liter, American planners discussed gasoline in millions of gallons numbers so large that their adversaries could scarcely comprehend them. Within U.S. headquarters, officers monitored supply flows with clinical precision. Colonel James Snyder recorded daily fuel receipts and expenditures, noting net gains even during heavy combat. To the Americans, fuel was not a luxury. It was an expectation produced in quantities unmatched by any other nation on Earth. The East Texas oil fields alone pumped more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. This abundance shaped world opinion. Observers across Allied nations saw the Ardennes as proof that industrial democracy could outproduce authoritarian militarism. Britain, still recovering from years of rationing and bombings, marveled at the endless convoys rolling off American ships. The Soviet Union understood the message as well. Behind every American soldier stood a vast engine of factories, refineries, pipelines, and workers whose output seemed inexhaustible. At a strategic level, American doctrine emphasized mobility above all. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft were built around standardization parts, interchangeable, maintenance simplified, fuel consumption efficient. A Sherman tank burned roughly a third of the gasoline required by a Tiger U.S. Trucks averaged 8 miles per gallon under load, and when one broke, it was often faster to replace the entire vehicle than to repair it. To the Americans, destroying millions of gallons at Stavelot was not an act of desperation. It was an act of confidence. They could afford it. World leaders understood the implications. After the war, at Nuremberg, German generals repeatedly cited logistics, not courage, not tactical failure, as the decisive factor of 1944. They acknowledged that the United States had rewritten the nature of modern warfare. Battles would be determined less by generals in the field and more by supply officers, engineers, and industrial workers thousands of miles from the front. The world had stepped into a new era. Logistics was no longer the hidden backbone of war. It was the war. Today, the Tiger tank that once led Kampfgruppe Piper stands silent in a small museum at L'Église. Its armor is intact, its gun is intact, even its tracks, though weathered by decades, still rest exactly where the crew abandoned them. Only the fuel gauge tells the real story. It sits frozen at empty, a quiet monument to the moment when tactical brilliance met logistical reality and lost. Visitors often ask why such a formidable machine was left behind. The answer is not found in the scars of battle, but in the invisible threads of supply lines stretching across nations. That December, Germany lost not because its soldiers fought poorly or because its tanks were inferior. It lost because its engines were starved, while American engines were fed by an industrial system vast enough to circle the globe. The legacy of Hansfeld and Stavelot reaches far beyond the Ardennes. It marked the end of the romantic myth that wars are won solely by bravery, bold maneuvers, or the genius of generals. The truth was harder, colder, and more enduring. Modern warfare is a contest of production, fuel, transportation, and the relentless capacity to sustain movement. Courage matters, skill matters. But without supply, they evaporate like heat on winter steel. Joachim Peiper understood this long before historians put it into words. When he stood among 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel, he glimpsed an uncomfortable reality. What seemed miraculous to him was insignificant to the enemy. What his army needed to survive, the Americans could burn without hesitation. That knowledge was more decisive than any artillery barrage or armored breakthrough. And so the Ardennes became more than a battlefield. It became a lesson. A cautionary reminder that nations rise and fall not only on the strength of their armies, but on the strength of their foundations, the factories, the refineries, the workers who never see the front but shape its outcome all the same. As you reflect on this chapter of history, consider a question that echoes across decades. In a world where technology and supply lines grow ever more complex, can any nation win a modern war without mastering the logistics behind it? If stories like this help you appreciate the hidden forces that shape our world, Feel free to share your thoughts below and join us for the next journey into the depths of military history.